This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air. This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I am recording in a new spot. We have recently moved house, and so hopefully you don't hear the rumblings of the train behind me, but it's a beautiful wee spot. I can see the ocean, I can see Soames Island from here. It's a beautiful spot in Pōneke to be. But yes, first episode being recorded in a new place, and I thought a really good thing to talk about while recording from a new place and having a new position would be talking about positionality. And I thought it would really work well with the previous episodes where we have been talking about critical race theory. And I think if I reflect on the past couple of episodes, the critical race theory episodes were really kind of unpacking the system in itself. But positionality is about yourself in relation to those systems. So how does your specific location in our social world shape what you see, what you miss, what you assume to be universal? And so I'm really hoping that this episode gives you some tools, and these tools can help you critically think about your position in the world and help you challenge your worldview, whatever that may be. So last year I read this amazing book called Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, and if you haven't read it, I really would recommend it. It's an amazing book, but essentially in the book, two people fall in love as I'm pretty sure in the book the city actually wasn't named, but the city kind of collapses around them as they're falling in love. And in the book, there's these magical doors, which are literal portals, which, transport people from one part of the world to another. And it's it sounds very fantasy-like, but in the book, these portals aren't really seen as this fantasy thing. It's literally kind of like a tool, kind of breaking down that distance between us and them. Because, ultimately what he's really saying is that everyone be moving. Everyone's already in transit. The key difference here in our system is whether that movement is called migration or vacation. It's the difference between fleeing or traveling. It's the difference between being an immigrant and an expat. And just if you do go on to read this book, do not worry, I haven't spoiled it for you. But yeah, that's the premise of it. And so, that gap, between the same action meaning completely different things depending on who is doing it is kind of what we're talking about today. So yeah, today's episode is all about positionality. Where does this word come from? It comes out of academic sociology and feminist theory. And, we're not going to try and get too heavy into the theory of it, but I promise you, positionality is one of the most practically useful concepts I have ever come across, even though it does come from very theory, academic background or origin story. It really, once I really understood what positionality was and is, it changes how I read the news. It changes how I have difficult conversations. It changed what questions I ask, and it also makes me acutely aware of what I can't see on my own. So the whole point of positionality is where you stand is what you see. So let's take it right to the beginning, to to the top. So what is positionality? In its essence, most basic idea, it's who you are shapes what you know. And specifically, your social location, your race, gender, class, sexuality, nationality, religion, age, ability or disability, it gives you particular vantage points, while simultaneously blocking others from view. And it's not a new idea per se. Philosophers have kind of wrestled with the relationship between the knower and the known for centuries, and positionality as like a named applied concept kind of emerged primarily from feminist ideology in the 80s and 90s. So we had people like Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, and Donna Haraway who were asking that really radical question of like, who gets to count as a neutral observer, whose knowledge is treated as universal and whose is treated as particular. And Donna Haraway in particular called this the God trick, the idea that there's some view from nowhere, like a detached, objective perspective that just kind of floats above the messy, particulars of human life. And she made this compelling argument that this perspective doesn't actually exist. It's every perspective comes from somewhere, and that every analysis is conducted by a specific person in a specific body with a specific history in a specific time and place with a specific upbringing and culture. And so the question isn't whether your position shapes your knowledge, because it does. The question is whether you know that and what are you going to do with that knowledge. And then homegirl Patricia Hill Collins kind of took this even further with her idea of the matrix of domination. And that's the idea that race, class, gender, sexuality, and, every other facet that kind of makes up our being, it doesn't operate independently. They intersect, and then they create specific and unique social locations. And each of these locations comes with a particular form of knowledge and particular blind spot. And I really want to be heavy on just like how unique this is, because of course it's like all the facets that make up who we are that intersect and create these unique social locations, but it's more than just like the facets of what makes up our identity. It's like the experiences that we have and the upbringing that we have, the education that we have. Like it goes deeper than that as well. And so that's why even if, like, you can't homogenize it, that's my point. You can't homogenize positionality per se. I mean, even among the same whānau, you could have different positions from each other because, again, it's just so unique and very specific. Like the way that all of these intersect, it could put you in a different vantage point to someone else. And so I really want to emphasize that. And another thing to really understand is that positionality is not just about what you lack or what you can't see. It's also that there's an argument that Patricia also made that marginalized positions often generate what she called outsider within knowledge. So it's kind of like a double consciousness where you understand the dominant system and your position within it in ways that the people who have that privilege in that particular system just can't. So I think another way, let's just take it to a real life example to make it not just theory. If you've ever been the only woman in a boardroom, you know exactly what the culture of that room is because you've had to learn it to survive it. But the men in that room may have no idea that the culture even has a particular character, because to them it's just normal. And so, that gap in awareness, that is positionality, baby. That is positionality. This is a really silly example, but I love this movie. I think we've all watched the Pixar movie Ratatouille. It is a classic, and we'll never forget that scene at the end where that food critic who comes into the restaurant all cold. I just remember he didn't even really have a stank face, but just like the way that he walked into the room, I was like, that man has never experienced joy. But the food critic takes a bite of the ratatouille, and then you just get like flashes of him being the small little child and like eating his mama's cooking, and you could tell that dish really just like unlocked a memory and a feeling and a whole entire world. And so in that moment, it's not just about the food. Ratatouille has become comfort, it has become home, it is childhood. And I remember young Amal, when I watched it, I was like, oh damn, okay, so there is joy there, just under layers and layers of being an adult, because that's what I thought adulting was all about when I was younger. But say someone else was eating that exact same dish. Let's just say Michelin-starred chef, grew up in a working class family, and is kind of now navigating the snobbery of that fine cuisine. And so they may taste that same dish and have a differently experience, The dish is just the dish. It means nothing more, nothing less. And so even though it is a very silly example, that is another way positionality works. It's like same object, same world, but different locations. So therefore, and to be specific, different social locations. So it has different meanings. And so that's what positionality is all about. So yeah, let's go back to Ratatouille, because I just want to say, really want to emphasize, in case my metaphor has failed, the difference in the reaction to the dish is not about taste preferences. It's different worldviews. Like, does this neighborhood feel safe to me? Does this policy seem fair to me? Does this history lesson feel like history, or does it feel like my family's story? It's like that. Those questions like that kind of tell you about the difference in worldview. And that's the same difference in the Ratatouille example, not boiling it down to taste preferences. Another example, if the Ratatouille one really just fell on dead ears, and if it has, fair enough. So novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has become a famous TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story. And, she tells us about growing up in Nigeria, reading British children's books where everyone ate apples and talked about the weather. And for the longest time, she tried to write those stories too, even though she'd never seen an apple and had never snowed where she lived. But she'd absorbed the message without anyone really saying it explicitly, that the universal story was a British story and that the normal experience was European. And in her talk, she says, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but they're incomplete. And they make one story become the only story. And I think that's the danger about positionality if it's unmarked, or if you're not aware of it. Because it's a position that doesn't know it's a position. So when one perspective is treated as the default, as the neutral, as the universal, it doesn't just tell its own story. It erases all others. And so Positionality always asks us to say, this is a story, my location. What are the stories I can't tell, can't see from here? So I think a key question after kind of breaking it down like that is, well, like, how do you actually do this? How do you identify your positionality? And I really want to be heavy with this disclaimer. This is not a one-time exercise. You don't fill out a worksheet and then you've done your positionality. This is a practice. Think of it more like a meditation habit or a fitness routine, just like something that you do every day. If you're not a meditator or if you're not a fitness person, think of it like, you gotta do the dishes every day. It's just something that you've got to do. It's like a ongoing thing, or like laundry. It never ends. But you do have to start somewhere. So here are some, a couple of steps to really get us started. First one is kind of, I really liked the imagery of like the facets of who you are and the life experiences that you've had intersecting. It makes me think of maps. So a really good place to start would be mapping your social location, and start with the big categories like race and ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, class background. And when I say class background, I'm meaning both where you came from and where you are now, because those can be different. Those can be very, very different. Even though I'm not making hella monies now, the life that I'm living at this point in my life is very different to what it was like when I was growing up. And I'm very grateful to my parents for making it work, because that allowed us to get into a position where we could pursue further education and go for our dreams. So, yeah, shout out to Abu and Hayo. But yeah, I just really want to emphasize that, because class background, it does change, and it can change. Ability status, religion or lack thereof, nationality, immigration status, language, age, body size. And, this is just not like a listing exercise. I think this is where it starts to get interesting, because I don't want you to just list these things. I want you to ask yourself, which of these have I ever had to think about? Because here's a rule of thumb that's not perfect, but a useful starting point. The aspects of your identity or life experiences you've had to think about are often the ones that mark you as different from the dominant group. The ones that you've never had to think about are often the ones where you experience some form of privilege or norm. And if you've never thought about how people perceive your race when you walk into a store, for example, that tells you something. If you've spent your life thinking about that or experiencing it or worrying about it, that tells you something different. If you've never had to think about whether the building you're entering has a wheelchair ramp, that's information. If that's something that you always have to check first, that's also information too. So I don't want this to be like oppression Olympics. This is about mapping the terrain. If we're really running with the map analogy, because what is it that you can see clearly and what might you be missing? And then also another thing to think about is asking about your formative context, right? Is because positionality is not just about the boxes you tick. It's also the world that you grew up in, the stories that you were told, the history you were taught, and the history you weren't. The voices you heard and the voices that were absent. So, some useful questions to maybe think about. I'm going to just throw them out there. What did your history education focus on? And whose story did it center? What did your family talk about at dinner? What was never mentioned? When you imagined success, what did it look like? Who did it look like? Who modeled it? What did you think was normal growing up, and how universal was that normal really? And normal's really, and you can't see me, but I've got air quotations. I'm checking them up in there. Who did you grow up around? How much diversity was in your daily life? And the scholar Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, writes about how white Americans are often raised in what she calls a racially segregated context in terms of social relationships, while simultaneously being taught that America is I feel like I always say this word incorrectly, meritocracy, where race doesn't matter. And so I think that combination of like actual segregation plus that idea that segregation doesn't exist, it just breeds a very particular kind of blind spot. And so, you don't see race because you've been told not to see it, and because your daily life hasn't required you to see it. And so experiences like that, which is not like a tick box of identity, but experiences like that is a formative context shaping positionality. Another step is noticing your own discomfort. And this one, it might sound a little bit strange, a little bit scary, but stay with me, y'all. Oh my gosh, I feel like a broken record. But bell hooks, okay? We're always going to be talking about bell hooks on Headscarves and Good Yarns. Wrote in Teaching to Transgress, about the classroom as a site of like radical possibility. And she wrote about discomfort not as something to be avoided, but as a sign that learning is happening. And real learning often requires, coming across something that disrupts your existing framework. And so one of the practices of identifying your positionality is to notice, when you feel defensive, when a conversation about, the systems or any kind of ism makes you feel personally attacked, even though no one has actually attacked you. When you hear about a statistic and your first instinct is to find a reason it isn't wrong. When you read a story about someone's experience and your internal voice, or sometimes for people it's their external voice as well, as evidenced by Facebook or stuff comment section, that voice immediately says, well, but not everyone is like this, or that seems extreme. That defensiveness, it is data, and it's pointing to something, usually to a place where your existing map of reality is being challenged. And the question, it isn't to suppress the defensiveness, but to get curious about it. Why does this feel threatening? What would it mean if it were true? I think another useful step in kind of mapping your isolation is kind of being purposeful about seeking out counter narratives, because you can't fully map your positionality in isolation. You do need other perspectives to show you what you can't see. And so, this means reading, consuming, watching, observing, experiencing widely and across difference. Seek that difference always. In the book Citizen, An American Lyric by Claudia Rankine, that book does something quite extraordinary. It puts the reader inside the experience of microaggressions and racial violence in a way that is just very undeniable and very visceral. If you've never had those experiences, this book will not tell you what to think, but it'll give you access to a reality that I think statistics just can't. It's a particular kind of storytelling that speaks straight to the heart. Or in the book In the Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, Baldwin writes to his nephew and says, "You were born where you were born and faced the future that you faced because you were black and for no other reason." The limits of your ambition were thus expected to be set forever. But then he takes it to another level. He tells his nephew that he must accept white people even though they don't yet know who they are, because their ignorance is also a product of their positionality. And it's almost as if like Baldwin just understood what positionality was before it was even coined or formally realized as a concept. Like he knew that whiteness was a constructed position, and one that had convinced itself that it wasn't a position at all. And I just want to make a quick note on intersectionality here, because as I've been breaking down these steps, it sounds like they're much the same. So, we know that intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it kind of developed, like that concept was developed because she noticed that Black women were falling through the cracks of both race discrimination law and sex discrimination law. And each legal framework looked at race and gender separately, which meant that the specific compounding discrimination that Black women face, because in reality you're not experiencing discrimination separately, was that compounding discrimination was literally invisible to the law, because the law had separated racial and race discrimination and sex discrimination. So your positionality is not the sum of your separate identities. It's a specific experience created by the interaction. Like a wealthy Black man and a poor Black woman do not have the same positionality just because they share a racial category. And a white working class woman and a white upper class woman do not share the same positionality just because of gender. That intersection creates something particular. And I also wanted to make another point about positionality as well, which is how is positionality different from privilege? Because they are related concepts, but they're not the same thing. And I think that difference is really important to get that right. Privilege, and I'm going to borrow Peggy McIntosh's definition from her 1989 essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. Privilege is about unearned advantages. The ways in which certain social identities give you benefits you didn't earn and often don't see. And in the OG essay, oh my gosh, I try to combine the two, listed everyday concrete privileges, like being able to shop without being followed by security, being able to see people who look like you in movies and magazines, being able to move through the world without your race being treated as like a risk factor. And, you really can unpack privilege much further than that, but I just wanted to start with that. But positionality is a broader concept. It includes privilege, but it also includes marginalization, disadvantage, and most importantly, I think, particular forms of knowledge. So, positionality is about your vantage point, not just your advantages. And in practice, I think the difference is, privilege is primarily about what you get or don't have to deal with, and positionality is more about what you can see and what you can't. And I think knowing the difference is really important, because, a conversation about privilege can sometimes slide into a really static accounting exercise. You have this many privilege points, and this person has fewer and this person has more, and this can be useful, don't get me wrong, but it can also become like a ledger that stops analysis rather than deepening it. It can be a bit of a barrier sometimes. But positionality is about knowledge. It asks, given where I'm standing, what can I perceive? What is structurally outside of my view? And I think that question is very dynamic. It shifts as your position shifts, as you move through different contexts, as you gain different experiences. And I think here I've got an analogy. Sometimes I know my analogies don't land, but hopefully this one will, that hopefully will really help you distinguish between positionality and privilege. So imagine you're at a parade. Some people are in the front row. They have the clearest view of the floats as they pass. Some people are further back. They can see some things, but not others. Some people are on the roof of a building. They can see the whole shape of the parade, the start and the end, the crowd, the whole geography of the event. But they can't see the details of the faces on the floats. And then there are the people in the parade. They have an entirely different relationship to the event than any of the spectators. And so the whole idea is that no single vantage point gives you everything. And crucially, the people in the front row often assume that their view is the view, that what they can see is what there is to see. The people on the roof may understand the structure but miss the human texture. The people in the parade understand the experience in a way that none of the spectators can. So, privilege is partly about who gets the front row seat, but positionality is about recognizing that the front row is just one vantage point and asking what we'd learn if we gathered perspectives from all of them. And another distinction that I want to make when talking about positionality is that positionality is not fixed, but it also can't be fully chosen. So, because you can't simply decide to not have your positionality, but you can expand your vantage point through practice, through relationship, through deliberate exposure to perspectives that you don't naturally have. You can learn to hold your own view more lightly. You can develop what philosopher Maria Lugones called, world traveling, the capacity to imaginatively inhabit other frameworks, other ways of seeing without appropriating them. And this is different from privilege because you simply can't opt out of it, right? A white person can't decide to not have white privilege, but they can become more aware of their positionality, and that awareness changes what they're able to do with that privilege. Period. And that's tea. And now I kind of want to talk about the things that we often miss when we talk about positionality. And I think some of these things might make you a little bit uncomfortable. Some of these things might push back on what you've heard before. But stay with me, because I think this unpacking these things about positionality might help all of us just look at our vantage point a lot more differently. First of all, positionality applies to everyone, including the marginalized or the oppressed. And a lot of this is what I've noticed in my personal 2 cents. In a lot of progressive and activist spaces, the logic of positionality has kind of hardened into something like what I'm about to say. The more marginalized your identity, the more credibility your analysis carries. And the more privileged your identity, the more you should defer, step back, and listen. And you know what? I will put this little disclaimer out there. Sometimes, especially if you're in an ally position, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily having a seat at the table or your voice is what's being heard, but you're creating a seat at the table and, you're holding up the mic so that those voices are heard louder. But I think that logic comes from somewhere real. It's a corrective to centuries of dominant voices being treated as the only voices. And it's a recognition that people or communities who live inside a system of oppression often understand it with a particular kind of intimate understanding and knowing because you experience it. And I think that's genuinely true and important. But here's the thing. Positionality taken seriously doesn't work as a trump card. It works as a map. And a map only becomes useful when you understand what it shows and what it can't show. And I think Patricia Hill Collins Mahi is really foundational here, whose work on Black feminist thought really, I think, highlights what I'm trying to say. Lived experience is a necessary but not sufficient condition for understanding. Being inside an experience gives you access to things outsiders genuinely cannot access, but it doesn't automatically confer total knowledge. It doesn't eliminate the other blind spots you have as a complex person with multiple intersecting positions. And I think a real concrete example, if we think about the corridor around LGBTQIA plus rights and race, a gay white man and a queer Black woman are both genuinely navigating homophobia, but their positionalities are so different that they can end up in genuine conflict about what the movement should prioritize, what victory looks like, and whose needs get centered. The mainstream LGBTQIA plus rights movement in America for a long time focused on same-sex marriage, which was honestly a priority shaped by the relatively privileged demographic doing that organizing. Like, for example, for queer Black people navigating housing insecurity, police violence, and workplace discrimination, marriage equality, while important, was not the most urgent crisis. And neither group was wrong about their experience, but one group's experience was being treated as the experience. And that's positionality failing to account for itself, even within a marginalized community. And this becomes even more visible when you look at something like the concept of the closet. For a white gay man in a liberal city with stable income, coming out of the closet might be primarily a story of personal liberation, right? A journey towards authenticity and acceptance. But for a queer person of color in a deeply religious family, or in a country where homosexuality is criminalized, that closet isn't just a metaphor for hiding your identity. It then becomes a survival strategy, and it can be intertwined with immigration status, economic dependence, and physical safety in ways that make the just come out and be yourself advice not just unhelpful but potentially dangerous. And so, the concept of the closet is the same. The experience inside it is radically different depending on your intersecting positionalities. Or if you think about the tensions that have emerged in feminist movements around trans inclusion, and I feel like this is live and it's contested, and I'm not here to adjudicate it. But what's relevant is this. People within the same broadly defined group can have profoundly different positionalities that shape what they perceive as the central threat, the central need, the central question. And that conflict is real and it's painful. But what I've noticed is often gets loudest, and people stop asking, what is your position and how does it shape what you see, and start treating their own vantage point as the obvious truth that any reasonable person would agree with. And recognizing that doesn't resolve the conflict, but it does change how you enter it, right? With more humility, more curiosity, more willingness to understand before you argue. And, there's also a version of this that plays out around class and race and ways that are politically important right now. There's a tendency in some progressive spaces to treat, working class white communities and communities of color as having fundamentally opposing interests. And there's a tendency in some spaces to flatten all working class experience into a single white identity. but both, erase the enormous internal diversity of each group. A black domestic worker and a white coal miner share, just examples at the top of my head, share enormous structural vulnerabilities, which is, that political abandonment, that healthcare insecurity, having to bear the cost of living crisis, and not being able to be in a position to save. It's just kind of surviving, but also at the same time occupying very different positions in terms of race and the specific histories attached to it. And positionality allows you to hold both truths at once, that shared class interest in different racial experiences, but I think flattening either one or kind of ignoring that positionality produces bad politics. And positionality is not a hierarchy of credibility. It's an invitation to say all of us have vantage points and all of us have blind spots, including me, including the people whose experiences I most identify with. And I think the most honest thing you can do is name your position and stay curious about the positions you don't occupy. I think another thing that doesn't get spoken about enough when it comes to positionality is that invisible center and why the dominant position doesn't know it's a position. We talk a lot when we have these types of kōrero about marginalized identities as positions. But what we really talk about the dominant identity as a position. Whiteness is a position. Maleness is a position. Able-bodiedness is a position. Heterosexuality is a position. Wealth is a position. Being neurotypical is a position. Being a native English speaker is a position. And so, the default is not no position. The default is a very specific position that has convinced itself that it's neutral. And that invisibility, the invisibility of the center is not accidental. It's, kind of one of the defining features about how power works. Charles Mills in the book, The Racial Contract, makes this argument with really good analysis. He says that white ignorance, that systematic, not knowing of racial history and racial violence is not a passive absence of information. It is actively produced and maintained because it serves a function. It allows certain people to benefit from unjust systems without having to confront these systems. So, ignorance in this case, it's not just a gap, it's a resource. And just really think and sit with what that means, because if you grow up in a society where you're really confronted with the history of colonial violence, or the realities of ongoing racial inequality, or the specific experience of people whose lives are shaped by those things, that's not neutral. That is a carefully constructed vantage point. The curriculum didn't include those things by accident. The news didn't cover those communities by accident. The cultural stories you absorb didn't leave those experiences out by accident. And I think a really good way of kind of talking about this is talking about the TV show, The Wire. The Wire is many things, and one of those things is being a masterpiece of positionality. The creator, David Simon, built the whole show around the idea that you cannot understand Baltimore or American urban poverty or the war on drugs from a single vantage point. And so the show gave us season after season from radically different positions, the drug dealers, the police, the schools, the docks, the newspapers. And the show showed that each of these positions carries its own logic, its own constraints, its own knowledge, and its own blindness. The police don't understand the corners because they're not on the corners. The politicians don't understand the schools because they're not in the schools. The newspaper editors don't understand the community because they stopped covering the community. And I think, this is where the knife really just sinks into the center of things. The people with the most power, the politicians, the commissioners, the editors, are often the ones with the most limited actual view of what's happening. And it's because their position insulates them from the consequences of their own decisions. Their positionality lets them act on incomplete information indefinitely because they're never personally on the receiving end of what they get wrong. If we think about a character like Ka Chiri Kaseti, the ambitious city councilman who eventually becomes mayor, sorry for the spoiler, is a devastating portrait of this because, he has genuine interactions. He actually wants to fix things, but his position keeps him keeps him removed from the consequences of his compromises. He measures success in polling numbers and press coverage, not whether the kids on the corner are safer. His position teaches him the wrong things and hides the right things from him. And the people who suffer the most for that are the ones who have no insulation at all. And that's the invisible center in action. Power doesn't give you advantages. It gives you the ability to not know things and to not suffer for not knowing them. And it's not just fiction, that, The Wire was a great show, but it's not just fiction. If we look at the 2008 financial crisis, the people who designed and sold mortgage-backed securities, who built, CDOs on top of CDOs, who rated them AAA while knowing they were garbage, many of them genuinely did not understand the human reality of what they were doing. They just saw numbers on screens. They saw risk models. They did not see the families who would lose their homes, their position, and, the regulatory apparatus that was supposed to clock them and check them was populated with people with the same position. And so they had the same blind spots. So, that 2008 crisis was not just a failure of regulation. It was a failure of positionality. It was a catastrophic collective blind spot produced by a concentration of power and people who had no experience of what their decisions would do. This is why when people say, I just don't see race, it really frustrates me because that is not a neutral post-racial statement. It's a statement about a very specific position and one that has the luxury of not being confronted by race on a daily basis because race does not operate as a threat or a filter in your daily life. And that's not neutrality. That's shelter. And mistaking your shelter for the outside world is just one of the most... It's a huge error. Okay, it's a significant error your positionality can produce. And here's something that I think is really wild when you sit with it. The people at the center of power often have the most confident analysis of the world while actually having access to the narrowest slice of it. And that combination of confidence and narrow is dangerous. I mean, we see it historically and we see it to this day. Colonialism, the ideology of white supremacy were, built by people who were absolutely certain they were right, and that certainty was produced by a position that couldn't see what was missing. And so, in this case, I don't think humility is a weakness. I think it's a quite rational response to understanding positionality. Another thing to understand is positionality is it shifts across your timeline, and humility is the practice. Because, we tend to talk about positionality as if it's something that you have, like a fixed set of coordinates on a map. If we go back to that map metaphor, but it's more like a moving relationship between you and the world. It shifts across your life in ways that are both gradual and sudden, and recognizing that change is how you hold your own certainties. Think about what changes positionality. Migration, person who moves from one country to another, the ability to see both cultures from the outside and the inside, to notice what each one assumes is normal because the other country does it completely differently. Class mobility changes it, both upward and downward. The person who grew up poor and became wealthy doesn't automatically lose their earlier knowledge, but they gain a dual perspective that can be incredibly powerful. And they also have to fight the pull towards naturalizing their new position as the obvious correct one. Having children changes positionality because suddenly you're thinking about safety and infrastructure and education and healthcare in a completely different way, because you're looking at it through the lens of someone responsible for a person who is deeply vulnerable and completely dependent on you, and dependent on systems functioning. Illness can change your positionality, particularly chronic illness, because navigating a healthcare system while sick, while fighting for your diagnosis to be believed, while managing work and cost and exhaustion, it gives you a real education in how that system actually functions that no healthy person can access from the outside. Aging changes positionality, bereavement changes it, loss changes it. I think there's something worth, the list goes on, but there's something worth sitting with here about what these experiences share. They are all experiences of becoming newly approximate to something that you were previously insulated from. Immigration makes you proximate to border systems and identity documentation and belonging in new ways. Parenthood makes you proximate to vulnerability. Illness makes you proximate to healthcare, the healthcare system and bureaucracy and medical power. Each new proximity teaches you something, not because you suddenly become a better person, but because your position has shifted and new things have come to view. Roxane Gay, the author of Bad Feminist and Hunger, she writes with extraordinary honesty about her own thinking about her body, her size, the way the world treats her, the way she has sometimes internalized the world's treatment of her. And that has evolved over years of living in it. And so, in the book, in her work, she doesn't present herself as having arrived at a final truth. She presents herself as someone in an ongoing process whose positionality has taught her things she couldn't have learned any other way, and who is still learning and still sometimes caught off guard by a new angle of her own experience. And I think that's the model that we should all be leaning into. Not that I have figured out my position and now I know things, but my position has taught me things and it will keep teaching me things. And the stance I want to maintain is ongoing curiosity rather than like a settled certainty. And this matters practically because it should produce humility, not just about what you don't know now, but about what you were sure of in the past. Like most of us, if we're honest, can look back and find beliefs we held with total confidence that we now understand to be products of a position we occupied at that time, a position that has since shifted. And I'll say this plainly. If you have never looked back at a view you once held and thought, I can't believe I thought that, you're probably not growing. And the retrospective humility is one of the signs that positionality work is actually happening. It is uncomfortable. It requires like an ego dissolution, the willingness to let your past self be wrong, whether it's publicly and privately. And you know what? Going back to James Baldwin, I think he did this with a lot of grace throughout his career. He was willing to revisit and complicate his earlier positions, on nonviolence, on protest, on integration, not because he'd been confused before, but because his position had shifted, the movement around him had shifted, history had moved, and he moved with it. And, he didn't pretend to have known all along what he came to know later. That I think that intellectual honesty, the willingness to be seen, learning in real time is one of the things that, that in my opinion makes him so endearingly trusted. And it should make you humble about the future too. What are you certain about right now that in 10 years you'll look back on with a wince? Is it, you don't know. And you don't know by definition. That's not a reason for paralysis, but it is a very good reason to hold your present certainties with slightly open hands, to be, invested in your conclusions without being fused to them. And we're coming to the end of the episode, but I've got a lot more to say on positionality, so I hope you have really enjoyed this breakdown of positionality. Next episode, we'll talk about how can that help us in the practical world. How can that help us become better allies, use our critical thinking skills, and how can we be aware of our positionality so we can be aware of our worldview. But thank you for tuning into this episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns, and catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air. This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.